Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. In this episode, we're back looking at the magazine with Volume 11, Issue 4, Wars of the 12 Tribes, Conflict in the Old Testament. Joining me are regulars Jasper, Oothuys, Lindsay Powell, Marc McCaffery and Marc DeSantis. Now, I've only just noticed that the only one of you lot who wrote for this issue is Jasper. So, in your introduction, Jasper, you point out that there's hotspots of conflict, in the ancient world, and your example is the Minden Gap, and I can't remember what the other ones were. And presumably these.
One was Thermopylae.
Yes, that's right. One was Thermopylae, which is mentioned twice in the issue, I think, because it's Michael Livingston's article mentions that Thermopylae is kind of moved because of the way the geography's moved. But I wondered if there was such, and in the magazine there's a mention of is it the Golan Heights being fought over, which of course is still fought over now. But I wondered if
the basic terrain feature you're referring to is the Palestinian land bridge, which is sort of it's if you take a route, if you're walking from, say, the Nile Delta, and you can only go, if you want to go east, you have to stay close to the coast because there's Sinai Desert, which is not very wonderful to walk through. So you're keeping close to the coast, and then if you want to go, at some point you want to go inland in the direction of, say, Syria, you have to cut through a mountain range. And that mountain range is where Israel is now, and the cut is the Palestinian land bridge. You can go east, and then you can go to the northeast. You have to cross the Jordan River, and you can all do that in that sort of one fairly small area. And because it is a mountain range on both sides, it's defensible.
And so that makes it the key area within the region.
Yeah, because Egypt wants to go northeast, and Syria wants to go to the southwest. And bang, there you'll meet. And that's why, you have the Seleucids and the Ptolemaics fighting there constantly. And it's probably why it's still an issue.
I'd slightly sort of missed that in the issue.
I tried to explain it. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned it. But
well, maybe that's what I was reading when I was thinking about making notes about the Minden Gap. Because you do like to mention the word Minden Gap. It's one of your...
Well, there's the Minden Gap, and there's the further one south in where the American army was supposed to stop the Russians. The Fulda Gap, yeah. There's Belgium essentially is another one. You can if you want to go between Germany and France, you can either cross the River Rhine, but if you're already to the west of the River Rhine. But you're not in France, then you've got the Ardennes, and there's gaps in the Ardennes. If you go further north, you get to the Netherlands, which has way too many rivers to be useful to cross through. So there's
loads of gaps. It's like a sieve. Is Europe?
Yeah. Well, there's the I think it's just still Turkey. Yeah. The Cilician Gates.
Cilician Gates.
Which is a gap in a mountain range that allows you to go from Anatolia down into Lebanon.
It's used by Alexander a number of times. It's used during the successor period a couple of times as a key, rush to grab that position sort of thing.
And so we have a similar sort of gap existing sorry, Jasper, what was the name of the gap? Does said gap have a name? A punchy title?
It's the Palestinian land bridge. It's not as much a gap as a bridge, but it does the same thing. It's in general, when you're discussing actually any military history, I think down to the modern age, the best thing. And people always tell us when we do questionnaires about the magazine, they want more maps, and I'm going to try and give them those, because if you want to understand military history and strategy on a level above the pure battlefield tactics, you have to understand what kind of terrain you're going through.
I mean, what kind of terrain is this?
Well, interestingly, Israel is a number of geographies, isn't it? I mean, what we now know as Israel is slightly different than the ancient biblical Judah, Palestine, all the other places. It's surprising. From the coast all the way to, for example, Jerusalem, it's remarkably hilly. I was surprised, when you see pictures of Jerusalem in the winter and there's snow. People don't normally think of snow in the Middle East, but you get it certainly in that part. And south and southwest of there, you've basically got desert. And of course, you sweep down towards the Dead Sea, which is the lowest point on Earth, and it's quite inhospitable to human habitation. You go further north, where the river Jordan feeds, of course, the Sea of Galilee, or there. It's very verdant. It's very different climatically, and it's very different from a landscape point of view. So it's surprising how many different kinds of geographical places in terms of the terrain that you actually find in that region.
And the title, I forgot what the title was actually. I've got shockingly prepared, haven't I? Conflict in the Old Testament. I mean, what dates are we talking about the Old Testament?
Well, that's very interesting. Of course, the first 5 books the Jews would call Torah, supposedly the books as given to God, to Moses, which go something like 1500 to 1000 BC, and the books after that spread the next 1000 years as they're written down. I understand there was an oral Torah before there was a written Torah, and the other books of Kings and Numbers and so on are after that. So it's quite a spread of time, actually.
The historical books, though, like Kings, Judges, Chronicles, those sort of span the era between, when Israel becomes a kingdom, somewhere in the 10th century BC, and when they get deported in 2 stages by the Assyrians and the Babylonians in the 7th and 6th centuries BC.
Is the major source of our source the Bible for that period? There can't be that many sources available to us.
It depends a little bit on the area we're discussing, but archaeology has really has provided a lot of material on that sometimes confirms, it often denies or contradicts the stories from the Bible, especially for instance these discussions we have to preamble. This is complicated stuff, and people have been debating them for literally hundreds of years, and it very much depends on how strict you want to be with your evidence, and it's constantly reinterpreted. But the original story of the Bible is that the Jews come from Egypt and they get into Israel, and it's conflict. It starts with the siege of Jericho. That really doesn't end very well for the Canaanites who live there, and it just it is a violent takeover of the newcomers, who then found a kingdom. That is the evidence. The archaeological evidence suggests that's not. It wasn't as violent as that. It was more of a assimilation of 2 cultures, and then you get at some point under the pressure of these. Israel is permanently stuck between the great powers in the north, whether they be Assyria or northeast, Assyria, Babylon, all those little kingdoms, and Egypt to the south. So the pressure and the constant pressure of what's going on there creates sort of forces unity on a tribal state, and then you get a kingdom. And the first kings that we know best from the Bible, like David and Solomon, apparently their existence is debated. There's there's an archaeologically attested palace that some consider to be earlier dated than others. So there, does it belong to David and Solomon, or is it for a later king? But then in the 9th century, we suddenly get Assyrian sources, and the Assyrians are pretty good, or are pretty eager to advertise what their kings have done. So they set up these stelae, which several are shown and discussed in this issue, with often a pictorial story at the top, and then there's a text below, and it says King so and so went here, kicked those people's butts, got the submission of that king, and so on and so forth. And sometimes those things mesh with what we find in the Bible, and it seems that the further down we go, sort of in the 9th, 8th, 7th centuries, we can sort of follow the story as it's narrated in the Bible, and add to it with other sources from archaeology. And that, the most famous one is that is in this issue, where there is a submission of a later king of I think Israel, by the name of Jehu, and he's actually shown on the stone to be prostrating himself before the Assyrian king.
I wasn't aware that the Bible, my religious ignorance, I wasn't aware that the Bible would make a good source for military history. How descriptive is the Bible for military historians?
It's very hard to say the Bible because, well, as Lindsay said, just what we call the Old Testament, it covers a period of 1,500 years, and it's evidently been first told by various people, and then written down and edited and re-edited by lots of people. I mean, I believe, if I remember correctly, that the Babylonian era is when they put most of this first part of the Bible into writing, but that's hundreds of years before they're done with the Old Testament. So it differs very much. I think most historians would say that it is the books we already mentioned, that Kings and Judges and Chronicles, that provide the most information that is, to some degree reflects what happened in actual history.
And so, for example, Chronicles is written around about 455 here, from what I can see. And you've got, for example, Proverbs is written around the 700s to middle 600s. So it seems to be the ones that would contain the military histories are way later than the 5 first books, the Pentateuch or the Torah. So in effect, they're contemporary, approximately, with the Greek historians. So that makes an ancient parallel.
But the big difference, and it's important to keep in mind when you're reading these things, is that they have a very clear mission. The point of the Bible books is to describe the relationship between God and His people, or Yahweh and His people, and establish to what the influence of Yahweh over what actually happens. So if something goes wrong, or if the people of Israel stray from how they're supposed to act, they get punished, and that might be an enemy who rolls over them. And if they then, they change their ways and they come back to God, then they become victorious. And that is always the undertone that you have to keep in mind. So it's not, the Assyrian army being more powerful.
You've also got to understand it as a skew towards the sort of the southern half of the, if I'm right, the Judea state, rather than the north in a lot of the early stuff after the split. So again, there's bias in terms of who's telling the story of what against whom, and
Because we tend to think of the state of Israel, but the unified state doesn't exist for a very long time in the Bible at all. In fact, they have a civil war pretty quickly, and they split. into two small kingdoms who sometimes help and sometimes do not help each other.
Have I always missed the joke, or the second subtext to the joke in The Life of Brian, where they sit there and go, splitter, and they're actually talking about the splitting of Israel into two kingdoms? Or am I just over now reading that?
We're missing Murray, who would be here to.
I was going to throw something. I was going to throw something in here. One of the things that I've found in researching my book about Bar Kokhba was this notion of the Gibor and the Giborim, who are basically these military heroes. So Judah Maccabee, for example, Samson, and these sorts of people, who are hero figures. They're military leaders who drive the Israelites to great accomplishments. And they tend to have a certain stereotypical side to them. They're physically strong, impressive men. They're the men you would see depicted with curly hair and a beard, and a full suit of armor and so on. What's interesting, incidentally, about Bar Kokhba is that he was presented as a Gibor, and it turns out he maybe actually wasn't, and that was part of the reason for his fall. So the interpretation goes. So what's interesting in the Israelite sort of battle histories, that if that's what they are in the Bible, you have to see it within this cultural context of the need to create these. That David is a Gibor, and so. Because this is what the Israelites look to, that they want someone who is a model example of the hero that's going to liberate them and take them on to the next challenge.
I think that's what the judges are too, isn't it, Lindsay?
What's that?
The judges in the book of Judges, like Gideon,
yeah,
those are that kind of character.
So for example, Samson, Judah Maccabee, and his brothers are archetypes of this, and there are plenty of others. In a sense, it's good storytelling. It's the hero, the good guy versus the obvious bad guy,
and it's the guy who has the relationship to God. And
there you go.
It's always that subtext going on.
Am I right in saying this? We're talking about the Iron Age at this point. If we step out of religiousness.
It's early Iron Age.
Ron, one of our patrons, thank you, Ron. If you want to become a patron, that's patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. Ron wonders, and I made a note of this question as well. What weapons do they have at this period? What are they fighting with?
I don't believe so much that the weaponry changed from the Iron Age, from the Bronze Age. It's the material that was most commonly used in those weapons. That is, they switched from bronze to iron, for example, in spearheads, swords, arrowheads, things like that. The changeover from bronze to iron as the more popular, widespread used metal is that iron, though it was later in time used widely, was actually a cheaper metal. It was easier to find in the Earth's crust, roughly speaking, than is bronze. That is, bronze I should say copper and tin are the elements that are used to make the alloy that is bronze. 90% copper typically, and 10% tin. And bronze was always a relatively expensive metal, therefore. So the number of, if it's an expensive metal, then the warriors that are using it for their arms and armor, they needed more to pay for it. And consequently, the number of soldiers, warriors who could be attired, kitted out properly, were very few in number. So we see in the late Bronze Age that military aristocracies dominated the landscape of the ancient Middle East as well as the Aegean region because of the relative costliness of bronze arms and armor. With the appearance of iron, which is dated roughly to 1000 BC, more people could afford this kind of weaponry now because iron was cheaper. That doesn't mean it was inexpensive. There was always an economic aspect to obtaining arms and armor of any kind made of metal that was there's an inherent costliness to it, but it was relatively cheaper than the bronze, and therefore you could have larger armies. They could overwhelm these military aristocracies, or at least you would have, if they didn't overwhelm the military aristocracies directly, power was not going to be held by as narrow a ruling class as it was, say, in the late Bronze Age. There was also, this is not merely a question of the materials used. One of the concurrent developments, roughly the turn of from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, was the advent of the horse as an animal that was directly ridden by the rider, as opposed to pulling a chariot. And this required the breeding of larger horses, but this also occurred roughly 1000 BC. And the Assyrian army, and I'm talking here about the Neo-Assyrians, the later Assyrian Empire of our period, they were enthusiastic users of horsemen. They also used chariots still, that was their principal striking arm, but they made widespread use of horses themselves.
And let's not overlook the famous sling. There's a reason why the David and Goliath story has a boy flinging a stone. It's probably the most ubiquitous weapon there is, a leather thong and a stone you can pick up from anywhere, used for thousands of years. And these people are very good with these things. And I think that it's easy to get carried away with the seduction of metal armor and all the rest of it, but probably most weren't, and they had to rely on much simpler weaponry. But don't forget, it's very effective, the sling.
It's funny you should mention the sling, because one of our patrons, Sean, had a question. He said, I read once that most of the slings were actually staff slings. Is that true? And if so, did those require more training, and how effective were they?
I believe the staff sling is a later development.
Is that the extent of our knowledge?
No, well, I mean later, as in later in the AD era. Then it may come from the east, but that's not something I'm very familiar with.
Sorry, Sean. That's the best we can do.
He sprang it on us, Sean. He didn't tell us up front.
No, you have to go back, for example, to 1 Samuel 17, and you actually sort of see the story of David and Goliath, and I think there's a mention in there, and it doesn't describe anything terribly sophisticated. What have I got here? David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine in his forehead and killed Goliath. 1 Samuel 17, verses 48 to 49.
But David is a shepherd. I mean,
yeah, well, exactly. So something really stripped down, very simple. You can make it pretty much from the ground almost.
That's not to say that he doesn't have a staff to go with his shepherding abilities.
Well, he might have a staff, but that's for, a shepherd's staff is for dealing with your sheep, and the sling is to keep wolves at bay.
Why did I make a note? I'm not. There might not be a question here, but I just realised I've made a note that said Goliath had scale mail armour. Is that in the magazine? Where have I pulled that from?
I believe that actually comes from the Bible itself, that they talk about his coat. It was very impressive and very weighty.
He's made out to be a big, scary, heavily armored. I mean, you can see the contrast as being talking about storytelling. Big guy, encased in armor, big sword, champion, professional warrior, and then here comes a boy. He's Benjamin. He's the young boy who's just a kid plucked from his job as a shepherd, and he's got the simplest weapon ever, and he just right between the eyes.
If you compare the description of Goliath with any warrior from the Iliad or from ancient Egypt or the Mitanni or the Hittites, they basically are very similar. They're almost the same kind of person, a very aristocratic, high-class warrior who has got the best equipment around. He's got the big shield. He's got the heavy scale armor. He's got an enormous spear. He's in all ways he's the military superior of David, except that David has the ranged weapon and he uses it very well.
Well, David has another thing with God. God is on the side of David too, and there's the reason he wins.
The interesting thing, though, you mentioned the comparison with other armies of sort of that era, roughly. If we look at the Trojan War and start talking about Paris using a bow and arrow, that has certain connotations attached to it in terms of a certain cowardice to it, firing from afar, but that doesn't seem to carry with the likes of David.
No, in the Homeric Code, fighting from afar was not considered an honorable means of combat, that you face your enemy with some sort of hand weapon, direct close combat. But
you sort of think in terms of like these sort of societies during that period, there seems to be a fairly good, connection between, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Egyptians. There are certain elements that are shared, the idea of xenia, going across cultures in different ways, and yet you don't have that idea of firing from afar being cowardly extending necessarily to the east, as you sort of have other concepts moving.
Yeah, I don't think it's an issue with the Israelite armies, to the extent they're armies at all. It's really about the victory. It's you use whatever guile and whatever clever tools you have, the ground itself, to achieve victory, and to lose is the worst thing. So if you have to sling from afar, hey, that's what you do. It's clever. You're using your head, and in fact, you see this all the way through to the Bar Kokhba revolts, where the Romanized Jews understood that the worst thing they could do was come into the open field and try and have pitched battle with the professional army. No, they came out from caves. They did what they did in a guerrilla, almost Viet Cong type war scenario, and they did what they did, and they disappeared.
So are we saying they undertook war in a different manner than, say, the Greeks of a similar period?
The prejudice against ranged weapons seems to have been really just a Homeric Greek thing, which spread later to the rest of Europe via Rome. I don't think it existed in the ancient Middle East.
The Greeks, we've talked about that before, I think. The Greeks have this very individual-focused culture where, the individual warrior has to be the best, has to be, at the top of his game. And if he doesn't fight in the prescribed way, if he's not at the forefront, if he's not kicking ass, he's ashamed. And the Israelites, the point is not that individual warrior wins. The point is that God is with Israel, and he will take care of it, and that's how they win.
It's much more of I was saying naturalism. That's not what I meant to say. I meant nationalistic point of view is the idea of fighting a war. That makes sense. It's more there's something there that's galvanizing peoples, maybe not nations, peoples. I don't know what.
Well, you're talking at a time when Jewish identity, Judah. It's a binding of people through religious code. It's a philosophy. It's an association with a one God, and that makes them the chosen people. So I think Jasper is quite right. So you look at this set of books which we now call the Bible, and you have to understand its purpose is different. This is not Thucydides writing, the battle of two great peoples. It's really going back to the underpinning of the reason why the Jews are the chosen people, and they've gone through all sorts of harrowing tests. From the time when they had to flee Egypt, they had to come to this land, they had to, deal with all sorts of terrible afflictions, and yet through all of it, because of their belief in the one God, Yahweh, they survive. And if you see it that way, all these wonderful stories of the Gibborim and the David slaying a much bigger man, it is in a sense they are a small people, but they are great because they are chosen. It makes so much more sense when you see it that way. And
at this period of time, who asked this? So again, Ron and I are on a similar sort of, Ron, our Patreon supporters, are on a similar sort of wavelength. Because I wrote this question down, and he also sent it in. What is the average size of groups groupings in battles that took place? How big were battles?
Well, the article about the Battle of Karkar does mention some pretty substantial numbers.
mentions chariots in the thousands, soldiers in the tens of thousands.
Exactly. But standard problem with ancient history. There's no way to verify the numbers. Although in a later period, there's only a couple hundred Israelite chariots that fight for the Assyrian king. So
again, it's a problem of what do you class as soldiers? Are they counting light infantry? Are they just counting heavy infantry? Need a bit more detail.
Yeah. On the other hand, the archaeologists have discovered various fortresses in which they think they have found sort of chariot barracks, which suggests that certainly hundreds is a possibility. But that's another problem. If you just find a floor plan of a sturdy building with some large open areas, and there's no chariots actually there.
The other aspect, of course, is that there are many great cities through this 1,000-year history. I'm thinking Megiddo, for example, which is featured in the article, which is quite a dramatic place when you actually go and see it. It's quite high up, and of course, it's actually many cities, one built on the other, in a sense, in the manner of Troy, and really thick circuit walls, and you get the impression that these were built to withstand siege warfare. So I think there's that other element also that factors in. We tend to think of these big mass battles, chariot battles, but there's this encamped army laying siege to a settlement, and you better hope that you've got cisterns with water to keep you going for the months of siege. And in fact, that's what, if you go to Megiddo, they do have these blooming great big cisterns. They're immense structures. Same thing with Herodium in a much later period. I mean, even Masada, for example, all of these, even though they're much later, the idea is always given to how would you withstand a siege, so they provide for food and water in great quantity.
I didn't make a note of the article. There's an excellent article in the magazine, actually, about the set of sieges. Going back to geography, so you just set me off on this line of thought. The whole area was, or the Landbridge area, am I correct in saying that was rather than one large fortification, was a series of fortifications? So it's almost like defensive depth might be not necessarily the right way of looking at it.
That's kind of how Graham, I think, explains it. Just a series of defensible cities and fortresses, so that when the say the Assyrians attack, they have to go expend so much. Gareth Williams, sorry, Gareth. The Assyrians have to take all these cities one by one and expend an enormous amount of effort and money and lives to capture them. And sort of just grind down. I mean, it's not a classic defense in depth in that it gets, outposts and then first line, second line, main line, and everybody withdraws slowly onto the main line and it thickens up. But it is like, as he says, a stone ring and ring in ring and a ring that makes it harder and harder and harder to get to the capital.
It's always I've found it interesting sort of thinking that up until sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, up until I think like 500 BC mark, that you've got you've got all these really well defended cities, you've got a lot of warfare and a lot of effort to actually, fighting back and forth between these, proto-nations or whatnot. But then you get to the Hellenistic period and you start having armies sort of just waltz through this area. And there's a big contrast there. There doesn't seem to be the resistance there in the Hellenistic era. It comes back in the Roman period, but it just seems to be a period of, I don't know if it's a reflection of what happens under influence of Babylonian and Persian intervention in the area, or is it just that they're not interested in the conflicts that are going on in the Hellenistic era? They are outside conflicts. They're not necessarily. I don't know how to interpret that.
It always seems to me like in the Hellenistic era, we truly only hear about the big battles, and there must have been so many more like small wars between various city-states and coalitions and smaller sieges and raids and everything. We just barely know about them.
But I mean, like if you think to the Hellenistic period after Alexander, you get the peace treaty, not peace treaty, but the negotiations at Triparadisus, smack bang in the middle of this area, and you sort of think, hold on, this has been a conflict area for so long, and yet you're staging the greatest get together of the era in the middle of it.
Yeah, maybe they were just, happy to be rid of the Persian overlords. It seems it's probably a somewhat modern interpretation. I don't know. I never thought about that. It's interesting. You're right, because Alexander just sort of basically...
Well, you get the Siege of Tyre, but that sort of that's the only real, I guess it's emphasised so much. Maybe we're missing something in the background, but it just seems that, inland from there doesn't seem to be the same resistance and whatnot. And then again, after Egypt, he seems to just waltz back through the area, getting back to the main venue of dealing with the Persians further to the northeast. But
well, of course, it could be the Israelites, the Jews, actually being very careful in picking their fights. They just retreat to within inside the citadel walls and wait for it to pass through. It's gone. Sometimes you don't want to pick on a big guy.
But it could be that there's, I don't know.
They're just so nationalistic about everything else, and every other enemy that comes through, they have I wouldn't describe them as the quietest group, and yet, yeah.
How often do you let an army walk through your area? It's
but it's a relatively short period of time that Alexander just sort of comes in, and just essentially just the regional governors, the satraps, and just all gets decapitated, and maybe there's a power vacuum and nobody knows how to grab it.
But then again, in the successor period, you've got Antigonus going at Ptolemy, and they are going back and forth over that area, but the conflicts seem to be on either side of it, not necessarily involving as much the local population.
It's always possible they cut a deal, and it's not written down. They just sort of said, we are coming through, we don't want any trouble, we're not going to pick a fight. If you don't pick a fight, are we kosher? Are you good at this? Good.
Another question from one of our patrons, David. There is a fair amount of information about Assyrian or Egyptian armies, but what about Babylon? What would the besieging forces at Jerusalem, 587 BC, have been up to? What was the standard practice to take in entire cities' populations into captivity? I think there's two questions there, isn't there? Three.
I'm not sure we know that much more about this area. It's the Assyrians everybody thinks of as the great besiegers, but that's mostly thanks to their wonderful reliefs. Typical, you don't leave the record. People go.
Well, if you're talking about, for example, the siege of Jerusalem, I mean, the one thing that works in the defenders' benefit or to their side is the geography of the area. It's very high up. It's actually quite hard to get to, and it was well defended as far as I know. So if you're the Babylonians trying to actually come up, you've got to trek a long, pretty steep hill to get there. I mean, nowadays you've got a nice road, beautifully tarmac road from Tel Aviv all the way to Jerusalem, and it really is a lovely road. It's only been finished in the last 2 years or something. And you are just aware, in the last 10, 15 miles, it's a gentle upward slope, but it's a continuing upward slope. So you can imagine doing that with a supply line and siege weapons and all the rest of it. And of course, the land around you is pretty mountainous. So you've got to take your supplies with you. And Jerusalem's well, Yerushalayim, as they call it, is a pretty good place if you're going to have a capital with a defensible position.
And the third part of that, was it standard practice to take entire cities' populations into captivity?
The Assyrians were enthusiastic practitioners of mass deportation. That was just something that was done. It was the Persians would do that too. It was,
Though it seems not to have been. Usually, I think it was more like the top layer. The people, the officers in armies, the elite of the town, people who might basically foster resistance. You move those people elsewhere. It's not necessarily, it's not necessarily useful to just move everybody.
And presumably, if you move the upper elite out, that makes them reliant on the new power, because their power in their new area is reliant. So you're almost forcing loyalty.
You're enforcing loyalty there, and you're chopping the top off the local elite, and you move some other people in.
In that case, should you redefine... when we hear about the Jewish population being moved, should we be treating that with more caution in terms of saying how big was that group that was being deported? I mean, that tends to be sort of painted as a very a mass migration.
No, I think actually the final capture and the deportation in Jerusalem is an exceptional case. Because Jerusalem is also destroyed. It's not in most cases in earlier cities. They did what we just said. They would just move the elite off, and that's it. But perhaps the Babylonians truly had enough of what Israel had been doing, because there is a case there of I think it's actually explaining the issue that the Israelites switched sides a couple times, or Judah. Yeah, the kingdom of Judah switched side a couple times, so perhaps as a punishment, they were more severe than they would normally be.
Do you think we've about mined this topic?
Well, I think we'll come back to it at some point. We'll actually make a point to research it better, but because we're covering a long period of history, aren't we? We're covering about sort of 1,000 years, maybe much longer. And it maybe needs to be chopped up into smaller bite-sized chunks so that we can study just a couple of things. Like we've talked about Assyrians before, and that was a remarkably fruitful vein to mine.
It is an enormous period.
It is, yeah.
But I think for a lot of listeners, it's a lot of listeners, particularly if they're people of faith. I mean, this is an area that they would be profoundly interested in, because it sort of is an important context for them. I mean, they like to think that Bible is historical to a degree, because it gives them a much surer footing to believe.
So don't forget, if you want to read this issue of the magazine, you can pick up a copy at ancient-warfare.com. And for more information on becoming a patron of the podcast, go to patreon.com/ancientwarfarepodcast. So that's it for this episode. We're between issues of the magazine with the next episode, so who knows what part of the ancient world we'll be talking about. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.